As many of you know, that we are involved in a sermon series on wisdom literature. I've talked about the book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, and today we'll talk about the book of Job. Wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible, I told you, consisted of 4 books. The book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, the book of Job, the book of Ecclesiastes. What I forgot to tell you as I was going through the wisdom literature is that I forgot a book. Actually, there are 5 wisdom books in our Hebrew Bible. Do you know which book I forgot? Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon, I think it was a Freudian slip if you really want to know the truth, because the Song of Solomon deals with the desire for one's beloved. And pastors and religious leaders have advised that book to be read only when you become an adult. They are afraid that somehow youth might read it and read the book of Solomon or the Song of Solomon literally and think about talking about only physical desire, when mystics of the church have understood the Song of Solomon in a spiritual sense, as a metaphor, God's desire to be one with the human soul. That intimacy that Bernard Clairvaux described as the kiss of the kiss. Our longing to know God in a real, impersonal way. But enough about the Song of Solomon. I'm afraid if I say any more, we'll never get to the book of Job. We're talking about the subject of lament. Now, the book of Job is probably one of the oldest literature we have in the Hebrew Bible. Many scholars believe that the book of Job in its original form did not have the first introduction, the first 2 chapters, and it didn't have the conclusion. What it had was a lament. Job lamenting the evil or the tragedies or the bad things that have happened to him and asking why. Why, God? I haven't done anything to deserve this. And yet, if we're honest, the book of Job is the minority report against conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom that you find in the book of Psalms, that you find in the book of Proverbs, that you find in Deuteronomy, which is the last book of the Torah, the conventional wisdom goes like this: God blesses the righteous, but punishes the wicked. Everyone knows that. You'll see this conventional wisdom reflected in the very first psalm of the book of Psalms. Let me read it to you. Psalm 1, which speaks of 2 ways, the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked. It goes like this: Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They're like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither, and all that they do, they prosper. But the wicked are not so, but are like chaff the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. So if something bad happens to a person, it's because they've done something bad. That's the conventional wisdom. The book of Job is the minority report that says sometimes when bad things happen to us, it's not because we were bad. In fact, bad things can happen to us when we're quite good. Job insisted that he had done nothing wrong to deserve the loss of livestock, the loss of family, the loss of his health. Rabbi Harold Kushner insisted that he had done nothing wrong as well when he and his wife were told that their 2-year-old son Aaron had a rare genetic disorder called progeria, which is advanced aging, and that their son Aaron, by the time he would be a teenager, would be a very old man. Rabbi Kushner said it was easy to believe when tragedy had not struck his house that somehow God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked, but he knew that he had done nothing wrong and that Aaron certainly had done nothing wrong, and yet they were experiencing great trauma in their life. Why, God? Sometimes those who comfort those who are hurting, in their effort to answer the why question, end up hurting those who suffer even more. Turn to the book of Job, and we see that in chapter 2, in verse 9, this is what his wife advises Job to do after he's lost everything. His wife says to him in verse 9, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." That seems kind of harsh, does it not? But before we're too harsh on her, I have observed this about prolonged suffering. It's hard not only on the patient, but also on the family. And sometimes in a prolonged illness, we're just not hardwired to see those we love suffer and suffer and suffer. And sometimes we know that death can be a blessing rather than a curse. That was certainly true for my mom, who for the last 2 years before her death got to the point where she didn't want to eat. And when she did eat, because of her diverticulitis, it was a very unpleasant experience. She suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, she suffered from seizures, and she just got to the point, the pain medicine took away her appetite, but when she did eat, oh man, she wished that she hadn't. And no matter what we tried to do to get her to eat, she finally lost the will to eat. I watched it from a distance. My family watched it up close. And I'm sure you probably have watched some of those you love up close. It's not easy to be with someone who's hurting, and we wish the world we had the power to stop it. So before we're harsh on Job's wife, let us understand that she was witnessing prolonged suffering and wanted to see the end. Now, Job's friends arrive in verse 11 of chapter 2. Listen to what happens next to poor old Job. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar. They met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. And so Job's 3 friends come to comfort him, and they see how much he's suffering, and they do something right. They say nothing. They just sit with Job. Stephen ministry has been described as a ministry of presence. And it is. And sometimes what we need more than anything is that someone else understands our hurt and our pain. Not that they can take it away, but they understand that they're present with us during the time of crisis. And Job's 3 friends did something right. They observed the ritual period of mourning for 7 days. And on the 7th day, Job finally speaks. And when he does, it's not pretty, because he's in great pain. And he curses the day that he was born. And he asks the why question. Why, God? Why are you doing this to me? And do you know what Job's 3 friends said? What's conventional wisdom? God blesses the righteous and punishes the what? And something bad has happened to Job because he's done something. So they tell Job he needs to confess, repent. Evidently, God is punishing you, Job. You just need to confess your sin. Even if you don't know what you did wrong, go ahead and confess it. And things are going to get better. But Job insists that he's done nothing wrong. And his friends, no matter how well-meaning they are, they only add to his pain. And that's true of us when we try to answer the why question. When we try to speak for God when we shouldn't. The book of Proverbs says this, and I like what it says. It says, even a fool is considered wise when they're silent. We don't always know why. We see in a mirror dimly, as Paul reminds the church. We don't want to do what one minister did. I can remember my secretary at a former church that I served. She came to me and she says, you won't believe what my sister's minister said to my family who were hurting. I said, what? And then she tells me the tragedy that befell her sister. Her sister had 2 children, and they were like 8 and 10, and they were running in the house. They had hardwood floors. And she had just waxed them and shined them, and they were running. And one of her children were running in white socks, not bare feet. And guess what happened? He fell and he hit his head, and he had a brain bleed. And then he went into a coma. The doctors, in order to give the brain time to heal, did a self-induced coma, induced him into coma. Now, the minister shows up. I said that it was like 8 and 11. The minister shows up, and this happened to the 11-year-old, and we'll call him Johnny. The minister shows up. He didn't say the first words out of his mouth, I'm so sorry this has happened to you. Do you know what the first words out of his mouth were? He says, how old is Johnny? The age of accountability is 12, and if Johnny were to die, he would go to hell. Wow. If that wasn't bad enough, he went on to say, as I come to think of it, you haven't been to church lately. If you had been to church like you're supposed to, this wouldn't have happened. Do you know what I said to my secretary? Tell your sister to get a new church. Who needs a God like that? Even a fool is considered wise when they're silent. Sometimes we want to give an answer when really there are no answers. I've heard people say this at the death of a child. I guess God needed an angel. Have you heard that? Do you know what happens when we say that? When there are other children? Do you know what they hear? I guess I better be bad, because I don't want to go to heaven right now. We're best off not answering the why question. Job wanted God to speak, and only God to answer that question. And so he demands that God answer him. And so in the 38th chapter of Job, out of the whirlwind, God answers Job's question, but not in the way we expect. He answers it with a series of questions that is meant to disorient Job out of the whirlwind. And he asked Job, were you there when I created the heavens and the earth? And Job would say, no. Do you know how I separated the land from the water? He would say, I don't know. Do you know how I created the giraffe? I don't know. Just a series of questions, and every one of the answers that Job gives is what? I don't know. What that does, besides disorienting Job, it puts him in his place. As a creature created in the image of God, and it prepares him to trust God, to bring good out of evil, which God will do for Job. As I said in the beginning, the introduction and the conclusion were added to the original version of the book of Job. You see, we are meaning-seeking creatures. We can't stand not knowing why. And so when the book of Job was compiled in its final form, when Israel was in exile, the readers had to give that answer why. So the editors wrote the introduction. God wasn't punishing Job. God was what? Testing Job. But as Rabbi Kushner says so well, this is one test I wouldn't want to take. And I'd have to agree. He would rather have his son be healthy than to pass any test. What kind of God does that? And so we see that really we see in a mirror dimly. Forget about the beginning and the end. What we know about human suffering is what Job knows, that many times we suffer and we don't deserve our suffering. Sometimes we suffer because of someone else's sin, like when someone gets behind the wheel of a car after they had too much to drink. And sometimes accidents just happen. I'll never forget. Henry had just got his license. This is a while back. This is ancient technology. You remember the 8-track tapes? This was during the 8-track tape. And he had a Doobie Brothers 8-track tape. And he was putting it in, and it dropped. And do you know what he did? He reached down and picked it up. And do you know what happened? He went off the ravine, off the road, down the ravine. His grandmother was a member of the church, and we got the news. She asked why. Sometimes accidents happen. And beyond that, I don't have an answer. But this I do know, that God can bring good out of every tragedy. He did it for Job. He did it for Jesus. And He's willing to do it for us. If we can trust Him with that which we don't know, which is only a little bit. We have seen how God has been in our past and how God has cared for us and loved us. Can we not trust Him that God can be part of our present and our future? I would like to think the answer is yes. Many people would say yes. Human suffering is something that happens to all of us sooner or later. May we come to know the God who loves us, who died for us, that we might have life in all its dimensions. Let us affirm that God's last word is love and life and fullness, that not even death can separate us from the love of God.